Welcome to Threat Vector, the Palo Alto Network's podcast where we discuss pressing cybersecurity threats and resilience and uncover insights into the latest industry trends. I'm your host, David Moulton, Senior Director of Thought Leadership for Unit42. In today's special episode of Threat Vector, guest Ofer Banan speaks with Kirsten Davies about the critical security challenges facing modern browsers. As organizations conduct more of their business through web interfaces, they'll explore why browser security has become a primary concern for cybersecurity professionals. Their conversation covers the evolution of browser-based threats, the balance between security and productivity, the role of enterprise browser solutions in zero-trust architectures, and how AI is transforming both attack and defense strategies in browser security.
Okay. Kirsten, first off, so great to have you here. I'm very excited. We've been knowing each other for so long and first time doing a podcast together. So pretty exciting.
Absolutely it is. It's been a long time since we've known each other. Can't believe we haven't done this before. So this is great.
For sure. So today we are tackling something that affects every business and every individual, the importance of secure browsers. We're living in a world that most of cyber threats start in the browser, obviously, whether it's phishing, malware, session hijacking, data exfiltration, malicious file downloads. Obviously, the way that we've worked has changed completely during the last few years. Now with remote work, which is here to stay all over the world, cloud applications, web applications all over, an increasingly sophisticated threat landscape. So the browser is becoming more and more the front line of defense. How has the browser become such a key target for cyber criminals? What do you think about it?
Because we do everything in the browser these days. We bank in a browser. We get our email in a browser. We look at our calendar dates in a browser. We have connectivity to applications in a browser. And that's just in the private life of an everyday citizen. When you talk about that at the corporate level, there's access by contractors, by consultants, by average everyday FTEs, folks that are the front line of work. They're accessing applications through the browser. Sometimes they're using a BYOD device and they're accessing their email. They're doing their day-to-day work in a browser. And I think there's a statistic out there for that was recently in the Key Insights for Security and IT Leaders that 85% of work today takes place in a browser. That's huge. I think it's a paradigm shift for us in the industry to be thinking outside of on-prem connectivity to in the cloud via the browser connectivity. And so as a result of this attack vector has exploded because everybody needs connectivity to do their work. And if they're doing their work through a browser, 85% of which, if you believe the stat on that, then this does become a huge attack vector for threat actors, everything from drive-by malware to the threats that evolve through the space of having a browser.
100%. And actually, if everything is in the browser, then there is no need to have the second hop, to take over the operating system, right? So if everything is there anyway, so kind of focus on the browser and the bad guys already got what they wanted.
Well, yeah, because bad guys are going for path of least resistance, aren't they? They're not here to make their lives harder. They're not going to do a super complex attack or an attack path if they can do something super easy, a spoofed website or a malware, drive-by malware, things like that. Those are low-hanging fruit that they can grab. So why wouldn't they? They're in it for the bang for the buck, and that's a super easy way to compromise, whether it's the identity going through and accessing an application itself, or just a click-through in and of itself from an email into a browser, into an application, just that click-through itself with the identity harvesting. It's just easier for them. So, of course, they're going to take the easy route if they can.
100% agree. What type of attacks are you seeing today that makes really securing the browser even more urgent than ever?
Yeah, well, some of them we've just been discussing right now. Super uh, low cost, low friction, high value attack vectors for these threat actors. Some of the ones that we've seen that are extraordinarily rudimentary, but also very effective. A phishing email, an email that you then, as an employee, they go, "Oh, I need to click here to get my latest pay stub. I need to click here to, access an email from the president of XYZ business unit," whatever that looks like. They click through, it takes them to a malicious website that they don't realize is a malicious website. And then they have a whole identity harvest that happens right there, right? Just a scraping of identities. Likewise, when an employee is looking to log in to an application through a web browser interface, there can be that whole, again, old school man in the middle attack. It can be a skin on a web browser in and of itself that does a redirect. I mean, these are old attack methodologies that are all new again because they work.
I think the easiest way to take over an identity and then the data of an organization, phishing still works.
Mm,
Unfortunately, phishing still works, and it's like by far the easiest. Finding the 0 days is much harder.
yep.
And now with AI, it's so easy to craft an email that no human being will be able to kind of say, "Oh, yeah, I remember the times that you had all of the typos in the email. It's gone. It's not there anymore." Right?
Right?
Uh,
That's so true. I sometimes I want to see a typo in an email because then I know a human wrote it. You know what I'm saying? As
yeah,
opposed to
no, it's
AI,
not
which
the
is
opposite.
yeah, exactly.
How do you recognize a phishing email? It has a perfect grammar, right?
Yeah,
That's
right.
that's kind of it's the opposite. Right?
Perfect graphic, perfect grammar, perfect syntax. Yeah,
Exactly.
I don't know. Hard to say.
Um, but then I'm wondering to myself, how could it be that browser security has been overlooked for so long and still today? What do you think about it?
Yeah. Look, I think some of this goes back to the human risk element, which is as humans interfacing with technology, not cyber people. So I'm not talking about the cyber industry of operators and practitioners. That's a small component, right? Outside of practitioners and operators in cybersecurity, the human element assumes that when I'm interfacing with a website, I'm the only person interfacing with that website. I'm doing something relatively mundane or relatively secure simply because I'm on the browser doing the work that I need to do. There's a presumption of security that's there. And so, along with that presumption of security, then is this whole thing of, well, what do you mean we need browser security? All I do is I type in a URL and I go do my banking, or I go access the SAP application at work in order to do the updates that I need to do, or pull the reports, the financial reports I need to pull. There's no assumption of any type of risk that's there. Predominantly because number one, the older generation of our workforce presumes security. I think when there isn't security that's there, it's a cultural condition of an older generation of a workforce, which I'm approaching. So don't talk about, I'm not pointing fingers anywhere. I'm not a spring chicken anymore.
So just look in
But
25. That's the thing,
oh,
yeah?
thank you. Yes, you can say that all day long. I appreciate that. But I think there's a presumption of security because that's part of a cultural habit of an older workforce. Then in a younger workforce that's a digital native, there's not the thought around security really mattering, again, outside of the cybersecurity and privacy industries themselves, because this whole notion of my data being private is a bit of a fallacy. I think it's a myth. Privacy is a myth. And so, because we post everything everywhere, digital natives post everything about their lives everywhere. There's no presumption of a need for security. And so this whole notion of needing security in a browser, I believe, has been overlooked because of the human risk element. Humans do not presume compromise. Humans do not presume,
Right.
ooh, lack of privacy, I should be worried about this. Humans do not presume that there could be somebody looking over your shoulder from a digital perspective, looking at what you're typing in, looking at the passwords that you've just typed in, which is, as we know, like either a screen scraper or a keyboard emulator, imitator, that kind of a thing. You know what I'm saying? So
Yep.
there's no presumption of a problem. And so when there's a lack of a presumption of a problem, there's not going to be hey, do we have security on this browser? We should maybe have security here. They don't think to ask for it.
And there are maybe there's kind of the thought, hey, it's so popular, everyone are using this consumer browser, so probably it's secure, right?
Mhm.
Like kind of the rule of thumb amongst billions of people, so probably it's good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a firm believer of there should be frictionless security where we are able to have frictionless security, but there are actually times when friction should be introduced so that people are aware that there is security. For example, online banking. I
love-
want to be prompted for multi-factor authentication. I
Yes.
want that as a consumer. Otherwise, I'm like, why do I have my money with this bank? Can anybody log into my bank account? Do you know what I mean?
100%. I think there are the points that you need kind of to trigger in the minds of the people suspicion. Hey, let's think for a second about security. I agree that friction should be very limited, but there are some points that you would like to give minimal friction to your global workforce. And that leads me actually to the next point, which is typically enterprise security was focused on endpoints, networks, identity management. Where do you see secure browser fit into this modern enterprise security strategy?
Yeah, look, I think it's a key component. So if we take a step outside of our traditional silo of security, right? So in security practitioning, security operations, we focus solely on risk management, risk reduction, right? What are the security implications of this tech stack? What are the ways in which of the data itself? What are the ways in which we need to secure the decisions that the CIO makes or that the CTO makes or the business leaders make, that kind of a thing. And that's important. Don't get me wrong, that's very important. However, if we take a step back from our silo on that, we realize that these decisions are being taken by CIOs, CTOs, for example, by business leaders themselves for more rapid connectivity, right? For more efficient delivery and ingestion and translating of data back and forth so that decisions, quick and effective business decisions can be made. There's a need for expansion of the business itself, whether it's through M&A or it's through just expanding product lines or things like that, geolocations, things like that. When we think about the decisions that the non-security executives are taking, enterprise browsing fits squarely within that. Why? The CIO is having to do more with less, drive efficiency, drive resiliency, and optimize cost structure. It no longer makes sense for CIOs to invest an enormous amount every year or every 2 years, depending upon their refresh strategy for endpoints and servers and all this kind. It makes no sense any longer for them to invest enormous amounts of money in hardware when you can have software access through a browser, right? You can do BYOD, you can have tablets, mobile phones, whatever that is, accessing the corporate assets, the SaaS services, things like that. It helps the CIO drive these optimization, availability, even resilience, right? And lowering costs across the IT footprint, the technology footprint of an organization or an agency or a department or whatever that is. So it's a long way around, Ofer, to say that the software the software security, yes, on the side of like a zero trust strategy, the access into the software, into the SaaS services must be secure from a zero trust perspective. But the access point through which employees, contractors, consultants, vendors are accessing these corporate assets is also super important, which is the browser, right? So it reduces cost, it drives efficiency, it drives optimization in the IT world for the CIO, the CTO. It puts data analytics, data insights, even AI tools at the fingertips of the business side of the house when they're trying to drive insights in order to make split-second decisions based upon revenue generation or expansion or, reduction, things like that. So this whole notion of the browser itself becomes the gateway through which the whole business, the whole department, the whole agency can actually streamline efficiency, have dominance in data decisions, right? Have accessibility at the speed of thought, as it were, for the availability of these SaaS applications and the tools that the front line needs in order to make decisions.
And I think one key thing that we're hearing again and again in the market is, hey, in the past, in order to isolate data from leaking out of the organization, we needed like VDI and Citrix and stuff like that.
Mhm.
If I can reduce all of that cost, have better user experience and also better security, it's like triple win, which is like the ideal golden standard for all three, right? Because CIO is saying, I want better productivity, I want better user experience, and I want to drive efficiency across the organization. CISO is saying, wow, I can do all of that and become much more secure in terms of phishing, DLP, web security, file security.
Yeah, 100%. It wasn't that long ago that COVID happened and the world had to work from home with like 3 hours of notice. I mean, I remember that and I laugh a little bit because it's still a bit of a twitch in every CISO's memory from how painful that was for the world from a health perspective, yes, from a fear perspective. We were all very afraid. There were things that were happening outside of our control. Life changed dramatically and irrevocably with the advent of that. However, I remember from a technology perspective, and my colleagues in other industries, so I'm not speaking specifically about my experience per se, because I wouldn't want to, only talk about my experience, but across the industry, CISOs were having to figure out that very thing. Do we do virtual desktops? Must we use, must we send hardware to everyone who needs this compute power at home now? They can't go to the office. What are the critical resources that are required in order for people to effectively work from anywhere? It was to work from home. Now it's working from anywhere. And while many organizations are moving back to kind of a hybrid model, some entities are moving back to a full-blown back in the office 100%, there still is the need for connectedness at any time from anywhere and with varying security protocols depending upon the confidentiality or the secure nature of the data or the assets that you're interacting with.
100%. Stat that I've seen recently, actually from Gartner, that 74% of workers will bypass security to achieve a business objective. And it's kind of clear, that since early days, security and productivity has been kind of in love-hate relationship, let's say. And what we think about it, kind of how do we strike the ideal balance between keeping the browser secure and ensuring the employees remaining productive?
Yeah. Look, I think it's easier said than done at times. I don't think this is a technology problem, though. I think it's a culture problem. So the technology is there in order to have, to implement secure browsing sessions. The technology is there to have more secure identities and zero trust principles involved with application integration, API calls, identity access into, again, bespoke levels of confidentiality of data and transformation and innovation. The technology is there. The culture is the hard part to change. And so I think as CISOs and as CIOs, we need to double down on this notion of frictionless wherever possible, adding friction where it should be in order to remind people, as we discussed earlier, in order to remind people that what they're interacting with is highly confidential, highly sensitive, whatever those things are. So I do believe that there's a lot more that we can do from a technology perspective. We need to be using the tools that are out there. We need to be implementing zero trust principles at pace, like not accepting that it's 5 or 10 years away before we're going to get this implemented. That's just not acceptable. It's absolutely not acceptable. When we really need to be doubling down on these areas of risk reduction. And that does take a partnership between the CISO, the CIO, the CTO, now chief AI officers, right? Business leaders themselves, heads of business units, because we have to do these things. It's not optional any longer to not have security around an organization's sensitive data. It's not optional to do that. Why? Because a well-placed attack can bring an organization to its knees. Ask any of the headline companies across the last 2 years, even just 2 years, you can go back and go, if you could have reprioritized this, would you have done this differently? 100% they would have. And that's not the CISO's job alone. That is the CIO, the CTO, the heads of business unit prioritizing these things that just simply need to be done. And I think I would say respectfully to my colleagues, to my business colleagues across many organizations, across a very long career, where I've been very blessed to serve. It's not that hard. Just do the right thing. Do you know what I mean? I mean, in dealing with IT colleagues and, God bless them, application owners and data owners, do the right thing. It's harder to actually put up a cultural fight than it is to implement the tools that are available to make these things seamlessly less risky for the users. It's a cultural challenge. It really is.
Agree. And I'm hearing this across the board. I think that the processes, change management, culture are typically the biggest barriers to implement the right security strategy versus anything else. And getting back actually to that point, what do you think are the most important considerations or key security features that companies should prioritize when choosing the right secure browser solution? What would you be prioritizing?
What's really important to first determine when looking at that, Ofer, is to understand the context of the business that you're in. So what does that mean? What applications and what corresponding data sets would better serve your organization, your agency, your department if they were more accessible through any device, anywhere in the world, whether that's at a substation for an electrical power grid, it's at, there's 7,000 privately owned waterways in America. That's part of our critical infrastructure.
Wow.
They need to have access at these locations to the data sets, right? Are you going to lug around, a server? Are you going to lug around a laptop with you, or do you want to have this accessible through a tablet, through that is secure, You know what I'm saying? So I think this context is super important to understand first, because you're not going to make an argument for a secure browser if you don't have anybody using a browser to access corporate assets, right? Duh. That's kind of like a Captain Obvious moment. Thank you, Captain Davies. Obvious. Okay. So once that context is understood, then it's looking at, okay, what should be the demands then for me for a secure browser? Well, first of all, it needs to very effectively integrate into my AD, my identity and access, even my privilege access management. It needs to very effectively integrate with that, because I need to have not only an identity of an individual and an identity of the device that they're using, but I need an identity around the session that they are going to be using. These are all principles we know as operators and practitioners. You just need to translate it into a browser session itself. Now, on the back end of that, what are the parameters, the constraints, the access credentialing around the application and the data sets themselves, as well as any innovation that's there? We can talk all day about AI and the use of AI also. Okay, we'll get to that then. And, you need to know on the back end, well, what does this particular employee, contractor, third-party vendor identity with their device, with their browser session need to access? And then how does that then meet on the other side, the API connectors, the access into the application, the data sets, and it may only be certain data sets in an application and not all the data sets in an application. Like, it's really determining what is the end-to-end session look like for the individual or the service identity or the robotic identity, because that's coming, right? Like, how do you actually map out the flow from end to end of what needs to be accessed? And then you build that into your requirements for that secure browser design, because it does have to be from the front end to the back end as well.
100%. I love this. AI.
Yep.
Obviously disrupting every aspect of cybersecurity, every aspect of our lives, for both attackers and the defenders. How do you see AI being used to enhance browser security?
Yeah, maybe, look, you're the technical guy on this one. So I'm going to turn around and ask you the same thing. But with a strategic hat on, maybe if I could look into a time capsule potentially, and be in the future and look backwards. I would hope that AI would support the human interface. And what it would do is it would very clearly identify when the identity of either the individual, the service, or the robotic, or the identity of the device that's being used, or the identity of the session that's being undertaken has abnormalities across it, right? I think AI is really well positioned to learn rapidly and to flag anomalies as well, so that there is an alert that happens that can then be triaged by a human using the AI, I think, to start with. And then, over time, the supervised learning capability of AI and machine learning, that aspect of it, which then turns into AI, perhaps even agentic AI, that then sits on the browser itself and detects what normal and abnormal looks like, interrupts the abnormal to add another point of friction, right? To make sure that there isn't something that is allowed to continue, especially to these sensitive data sets or these critical applications that are controlling aspects of your organization, critical aspects, crown jewels, or controlling critical infrastructure functions. You want to interrupt any kind of a command that's initiated if it's abnormal. I think that is a key use case for AI going
Um,
forward. There's some work on that right now. I don't know how mature it is, but I'm going to turn around and ask you the same question. What do you think AI's role is in this?
I think the best thing that AI can do for us is really the ability to learn from pretty much infinite amount of data. Because if you think about it, most cyber companies, the large ones, are seeing so much data,
Ugh.
but it's not as if human being can correlate all of that and say, this is normal, this is an anomaly, this is safe, this is risky. And the power of AI is really to correlate terabytes, petabytes of
Mhm.
data into steady
Rapidly.
state,
Yeah.
normal pattern, irregularity.
Yep.
And that's really playing nicely for the bigger vendors because they have unlimited amount of data pretty much. So if you think about the case of Palo Alto Networks, we have data coming from 70,000 customers
Mm.
globally. We are seeing every day petabytes of data. It's like
Mm.
so much data. And with that amount of new events seen every day, um, millions of new attacks, millions of new domains which have been registered lately. The ability really to correlate all of that is only possible, obviously, with AI. And we have thousands of LLM models which are correlating all of that, learning from all of that. And
Mhm.
that's the only way, honestly, that we'll have a chance because the bad guys are also using AI. It will
Yeah.
now moving from days to exfiltrate an organization and to take out the data to minutes. Right. So
Mm.
if we're not able to fight AI with AI, I don't think we actually stand a chance. Right.
Yeah. There's some stats around this. I love what you're saying around this because it's so critical. I think I read a stat recently that said about 65% of organizations have limited to no control over what data is shared in AI tools. So the majority of organizations don't even know what's being put into AI models. They don't have any control over it. So the governance of that is huge. And if the major hyperscalers, right, support vendors, for lack of a better terminology, without using the outright name of the company that you're with. But if there is a focus that's placed on this at scale, then I think that there actually is hope for the smaller to medium-sized businesses who are just kind of tinkering with these AI tools as well. And they're consuming SaaS services because they need them to reduce their IT, like their technology costs themselves, because they're just trying to run a business, right? They're trying to make
Yes.
money, run a business, hire people, grow their business, well, that kind of a thing. I just feel like, the Palo Altos, the HPEs, the larger, the IBMs, the Microsofts of the world can really do a lot here and should do a lot when it comes to training AI models, leveraging these petabytes of data and learning at rapid pace and at scale in order to help shape and form the industry, right? From a security and an availability perspective.
100%. Closing question, Kirsten. What is the most important thing a listener should remember from this conversation, in your opinion?
Ooh. Look, I'll end it the way I end many of my talks, which is the possibilities here are really quite endless. We're living in such an exciting time in history with the advent of AI. Really, from the private sector, obviously, the public sector has been using it for quite some time. Defense industries and defense agencies have been using it. Space has been using it for quite some time. But from a private sector perspective, we're really in the infancy stages of especially AI, agentic AI. Um, and yet, with all of that exciting innovation and all of that wonderful access at our fingertips, we're still having to be brilliant at the basics and partnering across the organization, the agency, wherever it is that we work, in order to enable and empower employees to do their jobs more effectively, more securely, more optimally. And we as security practitioners, security operators, technology and risk professionals, whether you're a CIO or a CRO, we have to be balancing that conversation at all times. And I hope that that is the takeaway for your listeners today, to say, okay, how can I balance out all of these conversations of, yes, there has to be risk reduction. Yes, there needs to be security principles, but there also needs to be optimal cost, availability, resiliency of solutions that are here and tools that are here for the employees. And at all times, we need to be driving costs down, right? We need to be thinking about this in our mindset. And I hope that while we're innovating, by the way, so not just those things, but we also have to innovate at the same time. So I think, I hope that that's the takeaway that people have, is that it's a great opportunity, but it's also a tremendous responsibility in order to be on the front foot, thinking about these things and balancing these conversations at all times.
I love this. Kirsten, you are amazing as always. Thank you so much.
It's such a pleasure to join you. Always so great to have a conversation with you, Ofer. Thanks for having me.
That's it for today. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe wherever you listen and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Those reviews and your feedback really do help me understand what you want to hear about. I want to thank our executive producer, Michael Heller, our content and production teams, which include Kenny Miller, Joe Benacourt, and Virginia Tran. Elliot Peltzman edits the show and mixes the audio. We'll be back next week. Until then, stay secure, stay vigilant. Goodbye for now.